Hello folks, it's David with URAL Motorcycles. In this video I'm going to be going over something that's been covered many times, which is valve adjustment, but I'm going to focus primarily on the 2014 and newer fuel injected models. We're not going to go into the carbureted bikes from 650 era or the early 750 era, other than an honorable mention when it comes to some of the parts that are still available, like gaskets. We'll talk about some hard parts real quick and replacement parts, and then we'll get into adjusting our 2021 model that we have here. So what you see represented on the table here is the 3 generations of overhead valve. Just for identification purposes only, you have the 650, which was the oval valve cover. If you're ever looking at the motors in a picture or something, it's pretty easy to identify them by the valve covers. You got the 750. This was all the way from the carbureted 750 models through the beginning of the first generation of fuel injection, and then more recently with the second generation EFI, you've got the new 4-bolt valve cover, completely redesigned. This came about with the advancements that we made in the heads and valve train and things like that. So starting with the 650 valve cover, it's actually my favorite looking valve cover, very retro looking. Of all the Urals, I thought this was the most attractive. But as time went on, that was replaced, and it was retained with a washer, and same with the 750, a single nut. Now this nut is actually a 12 millimeter, but sometimes, depending on the tools that you have, you can't always fit a 12 millimeter socket on it because of the manufacturing of these varied throughout the years. So oftentimes it was best to use a wrench. I've seen people trying to put a 13 millimeter on it. They end up stripping the outside of it, and then it makes it a little difficult to get off. So these were always 12 millimeter throughout the years. The 650 was actually a fine thread, and then the 750, at some point, it was fine thread at the beginning, and then at some point it switched over to a regular 1.25 thread, coarse thread. But the records back then, I don't have a good date of when that change was made. So as far as 650s go, we still do carry a graphite Kevlar composite valve cover gasket that we source here in the United States. We keep those in stock just for the folks with the 650s that still have those around. Yeah, we still keep some of the maintenance parts like oil filters and valve cover gaskets. Now the 750 valve cover that you see here, this had a couple different configurations of it. This was the most common with the line going through it, and then, like I said, the single 12 millimeter retaining nut that held it on, and there would have been a washer under there too. There was a slightly different version for the retro, which a lot of people liked, but for the most part, that bow tie shape was the outer bow tie shape, or dog bone shape. That's how you would identify the early 750s. Now the original stud, which, like I said, at the very beginning they were fine thread, and then at some point they went to coarse thread, and I really don't know when. Those ended up being replaced later on in the early EFI days with a new stud. It has this little part on the bottom that actually seats the stud so you know when to stop, and they also had a new nut manufactured that incorporated the washer, so you wouldn't have a tendency to lose it, and it dispersed the load a little bit better when it was locking down the valve cover and gave a little bit more even sealing on the gasket. Now, early on though, when we made the switch to this, a lot of people were asking about the large hole in the center. Well, that was to accommodate that. Locating the gasket and having it stay in place has nothing to do with this. In fact, you could even cut this out and it would still seal, because this had nothing to do with the actual gasket. The only thing it did, if this looks different than the gaskets you're used to on your 750, is that was just for that purpose only. So we still carry a graphite gasket for the 750s, as well as a newer production cork. All these gaskets that you see here are intended for one-time use. There are other ones out there on the aftermarket. I'm not going to plug any of those. These are what we use now, and they are intended to be replaced with every valve adjustment, or every time you go inside and open up the valve covers. And lastly, we have the current generation of valve cover, which again, it goes a little retro back to the old 650, but also more modern design by today's standards. I think it's a pretty attractive valve cover. I was pretty happy to see the drawing when this came out, before it was actually made. Now, this one having the 4 bolts that keep it on the new heads, you do have 2 different size bolts. You have 2 of these short ones that go on the bottom, here and here, and then you have 2 of the longer ones that go on the top, here and here. Now, all 4 of them have a rubber bonded sealing washer, and again, regardless of what you do at home, when you're maintaining your vehicle or your dealer, what URAL recommends as the OEM is that these are replaced on every bolt. So that's 8 per bike, and the gaskets are replaced 2 per bike every time there's service where you need to go into the valve train and remove the valve cover. So that's what URAL recommends. And then currently we are using as far as OEM replacement parts for service, we offer a quart gasket. Removing the 4 valve cover bolts on the new style can be done with a 6mm socket or a 6mm hex key. I'm able to get all 4 on both the left and right side without an extension, just using my 6mm socket and a ratchet. I can get all of them off without interfering with anything. As I mentioned before, this is going to focus primarily on the 2014 to current EFI bikes. The reason being is the markings on the flywheel are unique to those years. Regardless of the valve cover, whether it's the new style or, as you can see here, it's old style, even though if you're observant, you might notice it's got the newer EFI. That's because this bike has been converted from the first generation EFI to the second gen EFI, which is possible. We have a kit to do that. If you're interested, you can talk to your dealer or service center about having that installed. And yeah, this bike's got 60,000 kilometers on it. The owner is actually test riding one of our other bikes. This is actually the seat off of his original bike, which I don't know how many hundreds, it was over 100,000 kilometers, I think, before he traded it in on this 2014. But yeah, regardless of the valve cover style, if you have first gen EFI or second gen EFI, this procedure will apply because of the flywheel markings. If you want to see a video that would apply to early or to 650 and early 750 carbureted bikes, I will link a video here. It's an old service video where it shows Sergey performing the valve adjustment on an older bike. It's an older video, but you might enjoy watching it. The tools required on the newer Gen 2 EFI are going to be a 6mm hex socket and ratchet, or just a regular hex key, 10mm wrench, and even either a 13mm wrench or a small socket with an extension in your ratchet. This is for adjusting the adjusters and tightening everything back down on the valves themselves. The reason, oftentimes depending on the brand of tool you have, a deep socket, which would be simpler, has got a little bit thicker wall. So with my tools, the short socket actually has a thinner wall, and it's able to get in the recess on the rocker arm. You'll need some gauges to check the lash, your favorite spark plug socket, and then for our purposes here we're going to be using 2 different pans because I take both valve covers off at the same time, or you can do it with just one pan and do each side independently. The basic steps you're going to see here apply to all Ural overhead valve engines, past and present, but the specifics apply to Gen 1 and Gen 2 EFI engines, primarily because of the flywheel markings. On a cold motor with a 6mm tool, remove the 4 bolts holding the valve cover on, or on the first gen EFI, it'll be the 1 12mm nut. A little bop is sometimes required to get the valve cover to break free of the cylinder head, and you will get some oil dripping out, so be prepared for that. You will remove the valve cover gasket, as we recommend you replace it, and you will want to clean up any residue, even if it requires scraping old gasket material, depending on how well it's stuck. Now, I personally remove both sides at the same time, both left and right. And then down on the crankcase, you'll see a little rubber plug. When you pull it out, you'll see the flywheel and the markings there. On both the left and right side, remove the spark plug wires, and using a 13/16 spark plug socket, remove both left and right spark plugs. This will help ease rotation of the motor when you use the kickstart to rotate by hand. Now you can use the Kickstarter to bump the flywheel around. Your goal is to line up the arrow or dot or multiple dots that will be on the flywheel with the line on the case. The marks you're looking for will usually follow the large machined portion of the flywheel, either an arrow, a dot, or 2 dots depending on the date of manufacture. So look closely because it can be one of several icons. By removing both valve covers simultaneously, I'm able to line the mark up one time, and then by feeling for which push rods spin and which don't, I can determine which side to start on. In this case, the right side is hard, it will not turn, but on the left side, the push rods spin easy, so we're going to start on the left side. Whichever side you start on, you'll be adjusting the exhaust and the intake at the same time. If this is the first service, you'll torque the heads. To torque the heads, use a 15mm socket and torque each bolt in a cross pattern to 50 Newton meters or 36.9 foot-pounds. On the new motors, the heads will be torqued at the factory and then again at the first service, and do not need to be retorqued again after that. Use a 0.1mm feeler gauge and feel for a light drag under the intake and exhaust valve. Here you can see that the exhaust is a little loose, so we'll be adjusting that one. Use the 10mm and the 13mm tools to loosen the adjuster. And then by hand, you can use the feeler gauge and adjust till you get a light drag. and then you're going to lock the adjuster down. And then reconfirm with the feeler gauge that the adjuster didn't move. You still have the same clearance. Now you're going to reinstall a new gasket onto the locating pins. On the newer style valve covers, you're going to replace all the rubber bonded sealing washers on the head cover bolts. Replace the head cover. Install the bolts, short ones down below, tall ones up top. Run them down snug. And then this style, you're going to torque each bolt to 12 Newton meters, which is about 8.8 foot-pounds. On the older style with a single 12 millimeter nut, it's a similar process, but you're going to torque to 24 Newton meters, which is 17.7 foot-pounds. Now you're going to rotate the motor 180 degrees back to the mark. Repeat for the opposite side. Button everything up. Reinstall the spark plugs on both the left and right side. Use your socket to snug everything down, and reinstall the spark plug wires on both the left and right side. Replace the rubber plug in the crankcase, and you're done. Okay, so that's the video for this week. I'm going to check the oil in this thing and then take it for a quick spin around the parking lot. But like I said, everything you saw here, the basics are the basics for adjusting a overhead valve going all the way back to the 650 days. But the specifics that I showed, that's more geared towards the Gen 1, Gen 2 EFI based on the torque specs that I gave you for the like the valve cover bolts and the markings that you'll see on the flywheel. They were a little bit different in the early days. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you next time.